Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Angela. So my name is Susan McGregor. I'm at Columbia Journalism School, and the work that we're presenting today is Individual versus Organizational Computer Security and Privacy Concerns in Journalism, which is a bit of a mouthful, but hopefully we can sort of clarify what all that means. And this is work that I completed with my collaborators, Francie Rosner and Kelly Kane. First, I just wanted to say thank you, first of all, to the generous support of the National Science Foundation that made this collaboration possible. We are at different institutions across many, many miles, and that's been incredibly valuable, and also to our advisory board, some members of whom are here today. We'd also like to thank our participants. There were close to 30 participants in this study, and many of whom, all of whom gave their time very generously and shared really valuable information with us. So just a little bit on the background and motivation here. I think at this point we all know that journalists are targets of sort of privacy and security compromising attacks, but the part that I wanted to highlight here is the fact that actually we see them targeted in two ways. We see news organizations as a whole targeted. This is some research from Shane Huntley and Morgan Marquis-Boire presented at Black Hat a couple of years ago that suggested that as many as 84% of the top 25 news sites worldwide were the subject of state-sponsored attacks. Likewise, we see sort of the legal attack, so-called, often applied against individual journalists. So a couple of primary instances from the United States, James Risen and James Rosen, both individual reporters who were targeted for their specific work and their particular sources and records. So, one of the motivations here is just to say that part of what this tells us is that there are different motivations for the privacy and security compromising instances that that journalists face as organizations and as individuals. And the other thing that we know from prior work is that although we have lots of great tools out there, they're generally not very well adopted by individual journalists or organizations. The above pie chart is from a survey of members of the Investigative Reporters and Editors Network, which is a worldwide community of investigative reporters and editors, where 50% of them reported that they did not use any privacy enhancing technologies in their work. So last year we presented some work on the security and privacy concerns of individual journalists, and one of the things that this highlighted to us was that there was more going on than just what individual journalists themselves were reporting and thinking about. And so we wanted to do this work to kind of expand our view and look at a bigger piece of the ecosystem, right? Some of the evidence we had from that work was that there are other things influencing journalists' privacy and security choices beyond their own beyond their own preferences or abilities. And so we expanded this out to include other stakeholders that are within the organizations. This, of course, is still part of still a larger ecosystem around media, which also includes things like sources and readers. And we actually have some work under development right now that addresses these constituencies and how their understandings and choices may play into the privacy and security choices of journalists and journalism. So a little bit about our study design. We talked to 15 journalists and 7 editors and 7 technologists. Just to give you a brief delineation of these groups, individual journalists, all of these people were full-time employees at major or respected news organizations across a range of different media types, wire services, newspapers, print, whatever we would call that these days, multimedia. Journalists generally were people who spent most of their time working with sources, reporting and writing stories or producing stories in some format. Editors were people who had responsibility for others in the newsroom. And the way we distinguished this was primarily around their ability to, not only their supervisory responsibilities, but their ability to make priority decisions about others' work. So this means that our editors were people who had the opportunity to say, make decisions about whether or not a story would run at a particular time, whether or not a certain story might be pursued, right? So they have influence over the work of others in the newsroom. Technologists were people who sometimes worked specifically in an information technology capacity. One of the things we asked them about, which did not turn up a whole lot of yeses, was whether or not they were responsible for the sort of privacy and security choices of the newsroom, whether that was in their mandate or not. But these were, again, people who tended to run internal information systems at these news organizations. So the two key takeaways that we have from this work are, basically, the individual journalists and organizational stakeholders, they're in line on some things and they differ in others. And I think the main thing we'll focus on here is the ways in which they differ, but also that there are unique characteristics of the field of journalism and the way that journalistic organizations operate that make some of the more perhaps traditional solutions for encouraging use of privacy enhancing technologies or security measures not as appropriate with this community, and that gives us insight for ways that we might, suggest ways that we might move forward and kind of address the particular needs of this community and others communities that are similar or related. So on the shared priorities, we found, several things, basically source protection, reputational risks to the organization, and competitive advantages were all things that came up across all of these groups. So perhaps a little bit surprisingly, even the technologists said, brand is really important for us. We care about brand integrity. This is important, and of course, source protection. And so I've peppered in some quotations here because I think they're interesting. There are many, many more in the paper, so I encourage you to read it if you'd like to get a little bit more depth on this. This is an individual journalist speaking, basically saying, it's not just a problem for me, but also my news organization if I'm not able to protect my sources. And similarly, on the flip side, we have an editor saying, we've got a pretty good reputation, but it could get blown away in an instant. So we have to protect everyone because otherwise we'll never live it down. So there's a very binary attitude towards compromise on these things, which is basically that once a reputation is damaged, it is extremely difficult to retrieve. And so things like source protection and the brand image are extremely high priority. They have different priorities, though, and I think this sort of summarizes one of the huge motivations for this work. We found several core concerns for organizational stakeholders that didn't even make it on the radar of individual journalists. So individual journalists very concerned about how they communicate with sources, didn't even mention phishing, didn't mention password sharing. We had one person who said something about the security of third-party applications, but otherwise, and then finite resources, of course, how much time you have in a day to do what things was very much a concern for organizational stakeholders. So again, just some illustrative quotes here. An example of an editor talking about a phishing incident that was highly compromising for this news organization, and that this is something that has happened more than once and obviously is an important priority for them. On password sharing, one of the sort of features of these interviews, we often ask people if they could have one thing, what would it be? If they could magically have a technology or a behavior, what would they choose? And this was actually a fairly common one for the technologists to say password security. Both sharing of passwords and the strength of passwords came up in that respect. And this is an editor talking about issues with third-party applications, right? And the common use of consumer-style third-party applications by journalists. But, as I like this, if you want to keep your recipes in there, that's fine, but be careful. And then finally, finite resources, right? I mean, I think this is something that we can all relate to, but the issue of management, right? So I think this is a really important point when we think about privacy-enhancing technologies and the real cost associated with them, right? So even in a free and open source software environment, there are responsibilities that have costs associated with them. So, who owns it, who's going to pay for it, who's going to pay for the licenses, but who controls it, who has to maintain it? These were all issues that were of particular concern to editorial and particularly technical stakeholders, right? Who's going to support this thing when people have problems? So, in many cases, we might find these are not particularly shocking. Many of these are issues that lots of organizations share. Obviously, finite resources are, for example, a challenge across the board. But there are, again, these unique aspects about sort of journalists and journalistic organizations that make some of our more traditional approaches maybe less successful in these cases. And it really has to do with sort of autonomy and uniqueness and decentralization, as well as a very significant peer-oriented culture. So the original graphic that I presented kind of showed journalists and editors and technologists as these finite groups, and really it's a little bit more interleaved than that. Journalists and editors, one editor will work with many journalists, one journalist will work with many editors, and the reality is that when it comes to journalists, individual journalists, their real value is actually in the uniqueness of their work. And so editors are often very reluctant to interfere with whatever process journalists have for creating the work that they do. And likewise, they're also highly decentralized. It's not like everyone sits in the newsroom all day. And so here we have an interesting example of an editor saying, I don't know who the subject of this story is, and I don't want to know. Because if I do, that's information that I can put at risk. But if I don't have that information, then I cannot do that. Similarly, we saw this from technologists, again, from a more technology-related perspective, having to do with passphrases. So this idea of even if we wanted to use privacy-enhancing technologies, how do we then manage that within the organization in a way that's effective and doesn't open us up to other risks unintentionally? And then here we have sort of statements from a couple of editors that sort of allude to this very peer-oriented practice. So, I love the sort of hedging that goes on in this first quote. They want to use services that we're a little less comfortable with, and maybe a little more convenient, and there's no prohibition. But we sit down and say, we need you to understand the risks, right? And again, we have another editor saying it has to be enforced, but not necessarily with punitive repercussions, right? So we see a real reluctance here to say, no, you must do things a certain way, otherwise no dice. So what are the insights? What can we learn from this? And again, there's certainly more detail in the paper, but I think we took from the original work and fleshed out here that you really need to consider all stakeholders, right? So, one of the simplest examples here that we asked, and in most cases the answer was no, was whether or not an average journalist had administrative rights on their workstation in the office, and the answer in most cases was no, right? So at that point, if they can't use privacy-enhancing technologies at all, even if they're incredibly usable, if they cannot install them, right? And so having to think about how the organizational stakeholders' interests fit in is necessary if you're ever going to get these communities to adopt these technologies en masse. The other thing has to do with sort of workflows and sort of thinking about like rallying around known protocols and tools. So if we go back to this graphic, what we can see is basically, I think of it as sort of a bubbling effect. Very often the journalists will come across sources who say, why don't we use this, that, or the other thing? But the reality is that the journalists don't have the expertise to assess individual selections, and the technologists are servicing hundreds or sometimes thousands of individual journalists. They don't have the bandwidth to evaluate novel protocols and tools all the time, right? So the more that the solutions we offer can rest on things that are already known and whose value is appreciated already, the more significant adoption we're going to see. Also, multi-party collaboration, as I noted, journalists and editors work with lots of different people all the time. You will work with a different editor on a weekday than you will on a weekend. If you're running a feature, it's going to be somebody different than if it's a blog post, right? So access issues and the ability to collaborate, especially document level collaboration, is absolutely integral, right? So, there has been some work on kind of content cloaking of, collaborative document editing. Things like that have real promise for this area. And then finally, just to reiterate, communication is so key, and this goes both ways. So we did have a case of one of our participants, who just said, "Listen, we've had some risks, we've had some incidents, and there's actually a great story about this person choosing to finally adopt two-factor authentication." And their experience was that when it was explained to them by a party that was close to them, who understood their priorities and the value was clearly indicated, they had no problem. There was no resistance whatsoever from the newsroom. But it's not all on the side of technologists needing to communicate more clearly, because of course it works the other way. So this is a technologist talking about conceptualizing a DDoS attack on the organization and saying, how much is this worth to you, right? As a technologist, I can protect something almost infinitely, but it's going to cost a lot of money. How much money is it worth to keep a story up for 2 days if it's going to cost $100,000? So it's by no means a one-way street. Finally, just to say that this is, our in the future, we're also turning towards other communities where we see this applying, right? And one of the ones we've been thinking about is the legal community, and we see that these things are very relevant in those communities as well. This is from one of our participants who has worked with lawyers, and a lawyer running into a similar issue and saying, I'd love to use PGP, but I contacted my IT department and they just won't have any of it. So that's all. I'd be happy to take questions. I do encourage you to look at the paper. There's a lot more juicy stuff in there, and thank you very much for your time.